Welcome to Acid Horizon, the Theory Podcast. It's been a minute since we have dealt directly with the work of Karl Marx, and after the overflowing buffet of Nietzsche-inflected discussions, we are putting down the pudding and getting back to the savory Sunday roast of the revolutionary science emergent in the work of a young Karl Marx. We deliberated for a bit about what Marx to cut into, and we thought it would be fun to enjoy a little riff session or a sparring bout, you can pick your metaphor there, on Marx's 1845 writing Theses on Feuerbach, which in my best recollection was described as a kind of meditation Marx had undertaken to get some clarity about his own materialist views, vis-a-vis one of his own primary philosophical influences and mediators, Ludwig Feuerbach. Marx, moreover, in working out his own materialist views, endeavors to uncover where Feuerbach himself failed to go far enough in his critique of religion and his view of theology as anthropology. In other words, Feuerbach's attempt to lift the veil on divine essences as the revelation of human essences, or what he called species essence. The approach that we want to take today is to approach each one of Marx's theses and do a few different things with each one. Either interrogate some of the historical and philosophical antecedents that was on Marx's mind when he wrote them, or we might simply explicate them in detail. Also, I thought it might be fun as the host myself to jump between various roles, such as devil's advocate or curious beginner, to either challenge or tease out some of the deeper implications in each one of the claims that we're about to discuss. And my job will be to read each one of these theses and reset the discussion. But before we begin, I just wanted to say thank you to everybody who's continued to support us. We are approaching our 4th year as a podcast, and the support seems to be stronger than ever. Really, if you're finding what we do to be valuable or important, please subscribe on our Patreon account. We take every subscription as a kind of vote to keep on going, scheduling more interviews, and hosting live events around the world. Now, I have a few opening comments that I'd like to make about the work of Feuerbach, but I will first turn to our expert, that is Adam, who's worked intimately with Feuerbach and Marx and so forth in his doctoral research. And then we'll make some opening comments, and then we'll get on to unpacking each one of the theses. Take it away, Adam.
Absolutely. So the Theses on Feuerbach, they were written in around 1845. So this was basically when most, if not all, of the major young Hegelian works were already available. Most of these debates within the young Hegelian circles have already been had. And who do I mean by young Hegelians? I mean a group of writers, ex-academics, journalists who were writing in and around Berlin in the 1840s prior to the 1848 revolution. Particularly journals such as the Neue Reiche Zeitung, like the new Rhineland Times, basically, which Marx edited, and the most famous contributors to the young Hegelian movement, or Die Freien, the Free Ones as they were known in Berlin, was, of course, Engels, it was Bruno Bauer, it was Edgar Bauer, it was Ludwig Feuerbach, Arnold Ruge, Moses Hess, people like that, and, of course, my personal favourite, Max Stirner. Now, these theses actually were never published by Marx in his lifetime. These theses, they are notes, essentially, that Engels eventually attached to his own book called Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy. And these are essentially notes on the method and notes on possibly even the limits of philosophy itself. So just to highlight some of the things about this text, whilst they are called by Engels, I guess, Theses on Feuerbach, literally Theses über Feuerbach, they are not simply limited to Feuerbach themselves. He is mentioned in the first thesis and in a couple of later ones. But this is really about the general method of philosophizing that characterized a lot of left-wing sort of radical Hegelian theories in Germany at that time. And indeed, taking on board, as we'll see as we go through this, other aspects from Bruno Bauer and his theory of criticism, which is something that Marx parodies later on in the Critique of Critical Criticism. And indeed, Max Stirner, who's, as I try to argue, and I will argue sort of today, his critique of people like Feuerbach and the young Hegelians, and indeed philosophy itself, does feed into the break Marx has with these thinkers, and he starts to formulate these ideas like dialectical and historical materialism. And it's through these breaks that we can see, these things summarized in the Theses on Feuerbach.
So obviously the Theses on Feuerbach remain somewhat fundamental and elusive in the Marxist tradition. Everyone from Adorno in Resignation to Martin Heidegger in his late interviews to Foucault in The Order of Things have commented on Theses on Feuerbach. What I think is really important in this text, and what I think I'm going to focus on, is on the status of the human being as an articulable thing within the history of philosophy, and Marx's relationship to Gattungswesen as it kind of develops out of this critique of idealism, as he explains it, but also, this next to the other kind of controversial text of Marx's, the response to Bruno Bauer. This is also one of the texts where we get an account of materialism that will help us situate Marx in relationship to Hegel. What it means for Marx to have, as all of our Marxist professors have told us, flipped Hegel on his head or given us a Hegelianism, violently put inside out. But what I want to focus on is how Marx discusses the human being and the human being's essential relationship to the social. So that's where I'll be for this go around with the Theses on Feuerbach. I think what you'll find is this is one of those texts that, as your education or meditation or whatever on philosophy develops, I think it's a text you should always come back to, just to see where you are, how it hits you, because I didn't have the pleasure of reading this text until like grad school. Like I didn't know it existed. So coming back to it again now has been sort of, years later has been somewhat staggering for me.
I think I have a lot of the same questions and concerns, in terms of my own philosophical interest and research that Will has. But one of the reasons that I think Feuerbach remains interesting to me and should be interesting to many listeners of our podcast is the relationship, in fact, that Deleuze has with Feuerbach. And this is something that I was introduced to when I was in grad school by my teacher, Jay Conway. But I had recently recovered an interest in the connection between Deleuze and Feuerbach by virtue of finding a paper by a fan of the podcast and a follower of us on Twitter, Henry Summers Hall, who's actually agreed to come on the show later in the year. And he has a paper, which I will link in the show notes, called Feuerbach in the Image of Thought. And so I want to present this, this is not simply a gratuitous mention of Deleuze. I want to show that if you've been working with Deleuze and you haven't been working with Feuerbach, there's already a lot of buy-in and a lot of connections that you can make, particularly if you've looked at the chapter in Difference and Repetition entitled The Image of Thought. It's chapter 3. We talk about it in our book, Anti-Oculus. And I just wanted to highlight what I think are some of the overarching concerns that Marx has, that Deleuze has, and that we should have as thinkers and thinkers of the new. And so I'd like to sort of invigorate the discussion and prime it for an analysis of each of Marx's theses by talking a little bit about what it is that Feuerbach is trying to do. Deleuze writes of Ludwig Feuerbach that Feuerbach is among those who have pursued farthest the problem of where to begin in philosophy. And to me, that's an interesting claim. What does it mean, where to begin? That's the question. And I mean, just to give it somewhat of a short shrift, and especially if this is something that you're already familiar with, it has to do with undermining what we call the dogmatic image of thought, or the traditional image of thought, which basically comprises a set of either objective or subjective presuppositions that enter into our attempt at philosophizing and thinking. But what I like about Henry Summers' Hall paper is that there are sentences, there's ways that he goes about expressing this that sort of open up an understanding of what it is that Feuerbach and Deleuze mean by getting underneath the image of thought, right? And for Feuerbach, what it means is that there is a fundamental distinction between thought, the activity of thought, and the way that that thought is either presented or represented, right? And so when we're thinking about Deleuze, for example, the idea of anti-representation, here the problem of anti-representation is right at the beginning of our endeavor to philosophize, right? How do we think about thinking in such a way that the system of thought that we present is not confused with the thinking itself, right? And so the thought which generates concepts and their systematic coherence is not the same as thought itself. And in order for thought to be presented, it must be done so, admittedly, in a systematic manner, in a way that presents a kind of image, but it has to do so in such a way that it develops an account of its necessary structure. And by doing this, this should take us ultimately, both for Feuerbach and Deleuze, to a domain that lies outside of thought. What are the antecedents to thinking that are beyond the domain of thought itself? Because one of the problems with philosophy and with thinking is using categories and systems in a way that gets overlaid on the activity of thought itself as to describe them. And that ultimately ends up as being insufficient. And so one example of this is Descartes' cogito. The idea cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. It moves from the idea that our consciousness of thinking to the existence of a thinking substance, right? And this is something that Kant criticizes Descartes on. The error is that he applies the category of the cogito to the intuition, which then constructs the category. And Kant believes that to be illegitimate. Feuerbach recognizes furthermore with Hegel, and this I get from Henry Summers Hall paper, is that the development of systematic thought presents a structure of the intelligibility of thought, but it does not present thinking itself. And one of the things that this recollects from me, and maybe this is another connection to be made here, is the way that Bataille thinks about Hegel, right? The system of absolute knowledge forecloses upon the subject in such a way that it excludes the experience itself, right? And so there's something of a resonance there. And in order to do philosophy for Feuerbach, he believes that we should return to the intuitions which precede the image of thought, that we must make an account of the conditions for the emergence of thought, which get underneath the pre-reflective presuppositions which erroneously guide thinking. And this, for him, thus sets forth the task of philosophy that we see repeated in Stirner's work and Marx, other Marxists like Althusser, Deleuze, and even Bataille to a certain extent. And why is this important? Like, how does this cash out for us? Well, the challenge that it presents to us is that if we don't get underneath the image of thought, and if we're thinking in terms of Feuerbach, if we don't get back to the intuitions, and we can talk about Deleuze later, if we don't find the outside of thought, what we risk doing is uncritically redeploying those presuppositions, which then create institutions and ideas already extant in reality. And then those things remain fundamentally uncritiqued. Some examples: the church, the state, the family, gender, biological sex. All of those things come into the purview of what it means to do philosophy, right? It means getting behind any of the presuppositions that guide our thinking erroneously in a way that reproduces or reinserts those categories. And so maybe I'll leave it there for now. We'll bring the Deleuze piece in later because we do want to focus on Feuerbach and Marx here, and we'll get to talking about the theses. Actually, before I go on, does anyone want to make a comment on anything that I said or anything anyone else said?
Just an additional thing in terms of the Feuerbach is that if people want to read any of the Feuerbach here on this, there's that collection, The Fiery Brook, or the collection called The Young Hegelians, and that collection, actually, that latter one, has a couple of really interesting philosophical pieces from Feuerbach, including the Provisional Theses, The Reformation of Philosophy from 1843, and the Critique of Hegel's Philosophy from 1839. And essentially, and this will lead us into the first thesis on Feuerbach, his critique of Hegel. Hegel essentially wants to, after phenomenology of spirit, his system begins with the logic. The logic aims at a pure beginning in thought, the pure beginning from, pure being, nothing, becoming. That's the opening dialectic. And for Feuerbach here, this activity of pure thinking basically gets rid of the real object behind that activity, which is the human being as a thinker. There is a thought that precedes the activity of thinking, and that is the thought of the human, the thought of the thinker itself. And so when we're going to think about the concept of the human being here, it's going to be this particular reversal that Feuerbach does on Hegel, that we need to go back to thinking about the thinker themselves, the human being that thinks and produces this activity of thought, and therefore moving from the subjective activity of thinking to the object under study, which is now the thinker itself. And this we can really enter on the scene with the first thesis.
All right, let's do it. And I'm going to skip the German, not because I lack the confidence to speak the German, but just to be speedy about things. So the first thesis from Karl Marx is: the main defect of all hitherto existing materialism, that of Feuerbach included, is that the object, actuality, sensuousness, are conceived only in the form of the object or of contemplation, but not as human sensuous activity, practice, not subjectively. Hence, it happened that the active side, in opposition to materialism, was developed by idealism, but only abstractly, since, of course, idealism does not know real sensuous activity as such. Feuerbach wants sensuous objects, differentiated from thought objects, but he does not conceive human activity itself as objective activity. In The Essence of Christianity, this is Feuerbach's book, he therefore regards the theoretical attitude as the only genuinely human attitude, while practice is conceived and defined only in its dirty Jewish form of appearance. Hence, he does not grasp the significance of revolutionary, of practical, critical activity.
You shouldn't skip the German on this part, folks. It's because the German is where all the meat is, because
you go ahead and put it back in
here, which is object. And German has 3 different words for object, only 2 of which are operative here. But so let me just go for one of the sentences again. So the main defect of all hitherto existing materialism is that the object, now in German, that is der Gegenstand, and then just move on to the rest of the quote. Actuality, sensuousness are conceived only in the form of the object. And in the German, this other, or second object, is objects. Looks a lot more like our Latin-derived term object. But it's that distinction between the first term in German, Gegenstand, and the other term in German for object, Objekt, which really puts a difference here. Because Gegenstand, take it apart, you get the German words gegen and stand. Literally against standing, that which stands against, that which confronts. An object which confronts you in experience, which confronts a subject, which confronts activity, which isn't matter of activity, and indeed, therefore, a practical matter. Matter, of course, in German also being Sache, which is a term which means both matter and what matters, and that's very big in Hegel, but it's not operative here explicitly. Objekte is more of a sense of a detached object, like the object of my study. Yeah, the object of the study of anthropology, for example, is the nature of man. Man taken as an object, as something more detached, given more relative independence from the process by which the subject knows it. In Hegel, for example, the most common used terms for object are Sache and Gegenstand, because in the phenomenology of spirit, the subject and object, the knower and known, are constantly in a dialectical tension with each other. In the phenomenology of spirit, consciousness tries to know an object, it fails, and the object that confronts it reveals itself to be something other than what the subject, what knowledge thought it was, and then knowledge changes. That's the development of the dialectic in that book. And so the shift from Gegenstand to object is what allows this idea of practice to come in. Because Marx's point is that the huge activity, the process of subjectivity, the dialectical process of working through, of the negation of negation, is left out of Feuerbach's critique properly, because the object of Feuerbach's study, the object of his materialism, is not a Gegenstand. It's not confronting the object in any sort of process way. It's confronting the object as an abstracted, individualized object. Now, in the essence of Christianity, the thesis of that book is that how do we trace our religious feeling, our consciousness, our sense of religious feeling of something being out there, which is God, and how that develops? What is the being of that sensibility, that sensuousness, that feeling that you feel if you're a religious person, if you're a Christian particularly? For Feuerbach, this feeling is actually, you feeling the human part of yourself, the thing that makes you human. Well, it's been alienated into this divine form, which is something that's both bigger than you, has all the fulfilled qualities of human beings, but is called God. Feuerbach thinks that's a human being. And it is only from the standpoint of theoretical criticism that you can grasp that idea. You can grasp that there's non-identity within the heart of God as a concept, as an object of sensuous feeling in our religious experience. And instead, the contradiction is because it is nothing other than the human species, the human essence. And therefore, to cancel that contradiction is to bring man down to earth, and we need to get rid of the church and put humanism as the governing principle of all we do. We serve only ourselves because we serve only the essence of our species. Now, this, and of course, this is another good time to approach the other phrase here, which probably caught some people off guard, the dirty Jewish form of appearance. That is the same, more or less, in German. The Young Hegelianism was not an anti-racist movement. They were Jewish Young Hegelians, and they did critique Young Hegelians for their anti-Semitism. Young Hegelianism was not an anti-racist movement because it has Hegelianism in the name. And Hegelianism was very much quite a German, very much European supremacist aspect of thinking at that time, particularly. But when Marx is saying this, he's referring to Feuerbach's disdain for appearance, and essentially the fact that the essence of Christianity is a book of linear development that places Christianity as the supreme development of religion against all other lesser development form of religions, which essentially consider religion only in appearance and not in abstract essential concepts. So the theses on Feuerbach, this first one, insofar as practice is not here, is that the object isn't allowed to be situated in objective life, in all of the objective ways in which practice is possible, and activity happens in the world of objectivity. Objectivity is taken to be an abstraction, not as the objective process of actual life. And this is ultimately because what Marx is doing here is he's taking Hegel, putting on his head by taking the dynamic of production, of dialectical production, dialectical activity, away from the idealists and inserting it back into the objective world. Because as subjects, we are not detached from the objective. We are actually in a relationship with the objective. Our subjective activity, our consciousness, is objectively part of the objective world, part of the Gegenstand, part of confrontations, oppositions, processes. It's basically saying that what Marx will say later, not in this text, but that consciousness does not determine life, but life determines consciousness, and that consciousness that is alive eventually goes to determine the life in terms of production and reproduction. But without that reversal, you can't get out of this Feuerbachian problematic, when we're only looking at the sensuous, the material, only in terms of abstracting from something which is already abstract, only looking at the abstract concept of man, rather than looking at actual humans, flesh and blood beings who produce these objective worlds around them and are produced by them.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much to add. I mean, I will say that, like, the notion of, like, a Judeo-Christianity or, like, paganism as a unified object put in opposition to Christianity is just a part of a really complicated network of anti-Semitism in German philosophy in the period. Everything from, Hegel's texts on the spirit of Christianity to certain passages in the genealogy of morals, right? The critique of Christianity is often also accompanied by a tethering to Jewish existence. So the sort of the anti-Semitic element here is important. But beyond that, I think the sort of simple way to get at this is to just really try to break down that what Marx is saying is that this account of human subjectivity is one that has no mediation with material conditions of that subjectivity. So it's completely devoid of any account of the conditions of its possibility. So in that sense, like this is Marx attempting to kind of Stirner gives this great image of Feuerbach pulling the gods down from the heavens and trying to implant it into the body of the human being and saying, look at how burdened we are. We've literally implanted God in us. In a certain way, Marx is actually trying to say, no, there's also another move we have to make, which is to take into account the element of the practical, which I think gets more complicated when we get into Marx's account of the social and what ends up happening to the notion of essence in Marx. That'll be later, though. So that's all I have to add.
Cool. Let's move on. This is the second thesis. I'm going to read it, and then I'm just going to throw a question and attach a question to it just to produce a little bit more buy-in. And you can avoid that part of it in the response, but maybe it will be helpful regardless. So Marx writes, the question whether objective truth can be attributed to human thinking is not a question of theory, but is a practical question. Man must prove the truth, i.e., the reality and power, the this-sidedness, die Seitigkeit of his thinking in practice. The dispute over the reality or non-reality of thinking, which is isolated from practice, is purely scholastic question. Okay, so here's a question. Man must prove the truth. I mean, let's take a question like the cosmological argument, for example. That is a question which often bears upon certain presuppositions about causality, the nature of infinitude, and so on and so forth. How is that question answered by a practical dimension to thought? I mean, is the importance of a question like that diminished in Marx's view? Is he trying to say something about the nature of truth, which can only be discovered in a sensuous reality, and we can't sort of posit these claims about the nature of the universe and so on? Sorry, my cat's getting in there, but Adam or Will, you're welcome to take it away.
I mean, in terms of the truth of our thinking, but if it's coming to the young Hegelians, to Feuerbach, the objective truth of human thinking for Feuerbach is to be found in the notion of the human being. Because for Feuerbach, the objective truth is the fact that the truth of God is man. And therefore, the truth of God is to be found in this new identity thinking of the human being. And this is a kind of criticism, by which I mean a kind of practice of thinking, which is basically all about identity. Eliminating contradictions such that contradictions are what alienate things that are identical from themselves, and then positing, as Feuerbach says, a new absolute identity, away from Hegel's thinking about the absolute as a kind of world spirit or divinized world spirit or divine world spirit, and thinking about man's need now to achieve identity with the human essence by inserting that into everything they do and getting rid of, say, Christianity and religion in general. And so when it comes to this question, man must prove the truth, the reality and power, the this-sidedness. Now, this-sidedness, of course, is interesting because for Hegel, to be one-sided is a grave sin. But in this sense, when Marx is saying this-sidedness, he's saying that the truth of thoughts is not to be found in thought itself, even in the thought of the being that thinks it, but in the reality in which thoughts have efficacy in practice, in the activity of the subjects who think them, and in the ways in which those thoughts are objectively embodied within processes in which they are actual. It is a kind of an inversion of what is actual is real, and what is real is actual, from Hegel, which is sometimes translated as rational, real is rational. And when it comes to these disputes over the reality or non-reality of thinking, who's arguing for the non-reality of thinking in these times? It's Max Stirner. Max Stirner is saying this abstract idea of the human being does not exist. It is no human. And Marx takes on board this critique, but Stirner's rejecting all of philosophy as such. Stirner's is an active refusal. He's not positing any kind of new methodology other than, I guess, in his distinction between what he would call servile criticism, which is a style of thinking which presupposes that thoughts have matter, have sort of substantiality on their own terms, and then compares thoughts with thoughts to see if there's contradictions, and what he calls own criticism, which is criticism which presupposes the sensuous flesh and blood thinker as someone who creates thoughts and it isn't even exhausted by their position as a thinker. It presupposes what is not thought. And this is a good way of getting out of Feuerbach, but Marx wants to take this further by reinserting that philosophical element of activity, subjectivity, dialectics in a way which doesn't try to reify these ideas of thoughts existing on their own terms. If anything, they're both trying to do a different means of escaping out of Hegel. When we say scholastic questions, I mean, he's basically accusing Feuerbach of debating, how many human beings can fit on the head of a pin.
I mean, I'll just ask a quick follow-up to that, and either one of you can answer it. Doesn't something about this, I'm just riffing right now. This was not a planned question, but doesn't something about this risk perhaps conflating a notion of truth and an anthropocentric projection of sorts that will insert a kind of humanism into any philosophical question that emerges after this claim?
I think we'll get to this problem later in the theses, and we'll probably get to this problem later in the work of Karl Marx, right? But the word that I think is going under-examined is not necessarily practice, but activity. Sure, the stagnant pre-given subject is sapped here, but Marx is retaining an unexamined given of the active, of the passage from potency to reality that forms sort of an account of history. In his early works, like the economic philosophical manuscripts, there's a remarkable kind of Aristotelianism at work in his early work. So I think there is kind of this risk of positing or finding yourself trapped again within a sort of what can we call it, like a mangled humanism. But it would only be a concern at the level of what does he mean by activity and what does he mean by practice. So I think I don't have a clean answer or a clean defense on that. Maybe Adam does.
It depends here. I mean, the German is Tätigkeit, which is like literally actionness, literally activity. In terms of where he's getting activity from, I mean, it's going to be. I mean, Schelling is a big thinker of activity, although I wouldn't want to posit too much of Marx and Schelling in there. I mean, if you want to go back to a really old episode we did with Thomas Nail on Marx and motion, there's something of a Lucretian element in his early education, and he imparts motion and that sense to something that Hegel does in the Science of Logic. And if you want to take activity as motion, as in sense literally production, the sense of moving, channeling things in certain directions and certain ways in which humanity is channeled through various logics, I think that could be a good way to think about it.
Shall we move on? So we are on the third thesis, The materialist doctrine that men are products of circumstances and upbringing, and that therefore changed men are products of changed circumstances and changed upbringing, forgets that it is men who change circumstances and that the educator must himself be educated. Hence, this doctrine is bound to divide society into two parts, one of which is superior to society. The coincidence of changing circumstances and of human activity or self-change can be conceived and rationally understood only as revolutionary practice. And go ahead,
Well,
Evan.
I mean, so I'm actually the version I read for this is the 1951 sort of Soviet edition of the Marx and Engels selected works, and there's a few differences between the one you get on Marxist.org and this. For example, thesis 3 includes, for example, when it says, hence this doctrine necessarily arrives at dividing society into two parts, of which one is superior to society. It follows that with a parenthesis saying, in Robert Owen, for example, who is a sort of a pre-Marxian utopian socialist. I just wanted to highlight that as an interesting difference here. But I also want to read out a comment I wrote in this commentary. I actually put out a couple of days ago before this came out. If people want to read it, they will link it down below. And what I say in sort of commenting on this passage is that the old materialism places the object as an idea detached from practice and hence from its vehicles, its mediating factors, which are in the form of the subjective activities actually conducted by those are sensuous human beings. Society's essence is not superior to society in producing it. The conditions are in constant reciprocal relation and determination in the historical time in which activity occurs objectively, i.e., determined by relations of practice as well as the acts of practice themselves as they actually occur. So what Feuerbach, for example, is doing is he's taking the human essence and saying that's superior to society, and humans are organized by their essential qualities. Humans are organized by human nature, and the state of human nature is currently in a state of alienation, and therefore humans act in an alienated manner. So we need to liberate ourselves, we have to liberate the species, firstly in our thinking, and then when we make the religion of humanity instead of religion of Christianity, Feuerbach does think we can just replace the two, just rename it. He says renaming quite explicitly in some of his works. Then society will follow. We'll be more in touch with our sense of ourselves, and therefore we will sense each other, in the properly human and humane ways. Marx's critique of this is that this is an abstraction. You've taken it out of the actual activity itself through which this alienation comes about. You doesn't understand that the revolution isn't just a revolution of thinking. It's not a revolution of religious deconstruction. It is revolutionary practice, and revolutionary is used in the German here. The coincidence of the changing of circumstances and of human activity or self-change can be conceived only as revolutionary praxis, because it's not simply that we are determined by our circumstances and our circumstances are beyond us. History is an active process in which past, present, and future all interweave dialectically in terms of, yes, men do not make history of their own circumstances, but nonetheless, humans are the things that create history in any circumstance, and therefore we have to reintroduce the practical activity of revolution, which Feuerbach wants, but he can't theoretically integrate into his abstract version of doing philosophy.
I mean, I think that that's right, but I really do want to hang on the essential element here about Marx's gripe being the question of the superiority of circumstance over society. Because the following paragraph in this same thesis is that the coincidence of changing circumstances and of human activity can be conceived and rationally understood only as revolutionizing practice. So for Marx, the question and the space of this practicality necessitates a social. Like there is still a necessary condition of the social, and we'll get to this later in thesis 9, where Marx has like a kind of a kind of critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, but I'm still stuck on how we get to this concept of socialization, of the socialized human being, because this is something that is expansive throughout Marxist works and anarchist works. Years ago, we interviewed John Protevi, right? And one of the fundamental problems that Craig kind of crept in with and sort of allowed for a critical discussion with Professor Protevi was on this question of sociality as the basis of human beings, and whether or not that just produces an image of society that can then loop back to a human essence, where we kind of free ourselves from the problem by saying that it is in fact kind of a socialized humanity that is the posited substance. I'm wondering now just how much of this particular issue does Marx actually keep as he moves forward in his work?
I think there's a bit of a direct answer to that, actually. And given the year that it was written, I think this was written around the same time as the German ideology. And one of the things that poked out for me here, and I have it in my notes, is that one of the driving premises of Marx and Engels' works is that the division of labor is a ubiquitous fact of the historical development of societies. And what he's saying here is that there's a split in society where there's going to be one group that seems to be above it and one group that's in it and subjugated by it. And that division is constituted by a division between what Marx and Engels identify as theoretical labor and every other sort of labor. And I mean, this manifests differently in different forms of societies. I mean, we can think in terms of the way a priestly caste, for example, would, mingle with kings and lords and nobility and what have you. And so, the division confers upon one section of society an epistemological advantage of sorts. They are the knowers, right? And the others are the receivers of that knowledge. And the creation and the circulation of those ideas in a certain way that maintains that privilege is what will reproduce the conditions of domination. So, and it's not only that the origins of those ideas are obscured, but the split itself is veiled in the process. And I mean, that's the connection I made there. I don't know if there's more to say about that. Shall we move on? All right. I'm not just the reader. I got comments. All right, let's go. What's the next one here? All right. Thesis 4 is Feuerbach starts off from the fact of religious self-estrangement, of the duplication of the world into a religious, imaginary world and a secular one. His work consists in resolving the religious world into its secular basis. He overlooks the fact that after completing this work, the chief thing still remains to be done. For the fact that the secular basis lifts off from itself and establishes itself in the clouds as an independent realm can only be explained by the inner strife and intrinsic contradictoriness of this secular basis. The latter must itself be understood in its contradiction and then, by the removal of the contradiction, revolutionized. Thus, for instance, once the earthly family is discovered to be the secret of the holy family, the former must itself be annihilated, theoretically and practically. It looks like we're talking about dialectics. Am I right?
And the sort of dialectics, which is sometimes overlooked in the various meanings of sublation, one of them being cancellation. I mean, to go to the Soviet translation here into the English, the last sentence is rendered as, thus, for instance, once the earthly family is discovered to be the secret of the holy family, the former must then itself be criticized in theory and revolutionized in practice. Quite different. Although the German is vernichtet, which is closer to annihilate. The negation is far stronger, just to give a sense of the kind of the family abolitionist sort of takes that Marx and Engels will eventually put out in the Communist Manifesto. But in terms of just a general comment on this, I mean, this is building on Feuerbach again, that Feuerbach's revelation, in his work, is that the essence of God is man, and religion is our alienation from our objective, the object which is our species essence, the object. this alienation of man from capital M man, big man, is a contradiction which is to be negated through criticism in thoughts, and particularly kind of, you can think of it almost like new atheism in a way. It's very similar in those days, to be honest. Yet, what Marx is highlighting here is that the contradiction which causes the alienation of man into God, of the creation of religiosity, religious feeling, is not a contradiction that is solely cited on the side of religion in terms of its abstract identity. Rather, the very creations of religion from an initial that arises from an initial motive contradiction in the material basis of this alienation itself. And the example he gives is the family structure, which becomes mirrored in the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, and of course also the Holy Family. And I've got another title, another later Marx, around this time Marx book, which is of course Jesus, baby Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. And it's here he says that actually the social being is the determinant factor here. And I think what is interesting on the level of thinking about sort of secular foundations, he says religious imaginary world and the worldly, literally says weltlich, worldly world, is that he is trying to flip over the conditions of possibility for any lingering idealism here.
Yeah, I think in this way, we start to get just a very clean articulation of Marx's problematization of a post-Hegelian history. And I think that when it comes to the relationship, and I could be wrong, but it's also here where we get the possibility of maybe what we could start to talk about as a relationship between, a broader set of established constraints being asserted as either transcendental or natural, which will be the problem in the 1844 manuscripts, right? Is the naturalization of the particular mode of production, and the practice that either maintains it or reproduces it. So I think in this way, it's just a good methodological argument.
Yeah. And just to give a quote from Marx, actually, from a little earlier, 1843, this is the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. He says that the abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people is a demand for their real happiness. To call on them to give up their illusions about their condition is to call on them to give up a condition that requires illusions. The criticism of religion is therefore in embryo the criticism of that veil of tears of which religion is the halo. And he's still more Feuerbachian at this time in his career, but you can see sort of to go back on Marx's own analogy, is the embryo of this thesis here. And it is very much in this particularly atheistic line of criticism that you actually get as well in people like Bruno Bauer, who was the person who introduced Marx to Hegel, supervised his thesis.
I don't have too much to add on that, although I'll just say that while I was reading all these theses, I really had Laruelle on the brain, and the split between, for example, a libidinal approach to an analysis of the social construction of institutions versus the analysis of these institutions in their specificity. And I think this particular thesis edges on, or at least it presents a sort of problem that I think Anti-Oedipus in particular goes after. And I mean, in view of what we did in our recent Laruelle episode, I think there's just an interesting juxtaposition that can be made between how Marx writes about sort of undercutting the transcendental illusion of religion, right? And seeing about how he sets about doing that in his project down the line versus, for example, what Deleuze and Guattari do. And the way that Laruelle, for example, analyzes the difference between, a Marxist analysis of the family, as we talked about, versus a sort of Nietzschean libidinal analysis. But I mean, that's more of just a connection I'm making than a constructive comment. So we'll just move on. Now, the next one's short. We don't have to linger long on this, and maybe we can just connect it to the next one. I don't know. We'll see. Thesis number 5, Feuerbach, not satisfied with abstract thinking, wants sensuous contemplation. but he does not conceive sensuousness as practical human sensuous activity. Actually, I think this is what's in focus in the entirety of the theses on Feuerbach. Maybe we can talk about that.
So really what Marx is doing here is actually taking on board another methodological point from Hegel. So Hegel, in the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit, says that the absolute is the result plus how it gets there, plus the way in which it comes to be. And for Feuerbach, he's not really focusing on the result. He's focusing on the presupposition of that process. So for Hegel, it's a presuppositionless process. You try and get the absolute sort of developing itself out of this pure activity, the idea developing itself out of this pure activity. Feuerbach says, no, this presupposes a beginning before this beginning, and that's the thinker, that's man, that's the human being. That is, it's kind of a rejection of this way of thinking. Whereas what Marx is doing is he's actually saying to Feuerbach, no, the standpoint of your thinking is actually the result of another kind of thinking, of a certain kind of social material determination, which characterizes your thought. And so your thought isn't a standpoint in the sense of a beginning, but your mode of criticism is actually the result of something else. And in order to explain your own thinking, for thinking to be sort of justifying or to have any reality or truth, we need to go to the process of the conditions that make it possible and how your very practice can be understood as practice in terms of how it comes to be. And that really does feed into the following thesis.
Yeah, but again, I just want to isolate again what this human sensuousness is tied to. And I think what we're going to see is that it's going to come down to Marx's problem with isolation. And I think for this, there clearly is an attempt to, like, if you read this, in a vacuum without an account that this is Karl Marx writing this, right? This would be an appeal to maybe empiric epistemic violence, right? That like thought precisely is something that's only possible through the violence of thought. At the same time, it's not simply sensuality, but it's going to be the uniquely human sensuality of socialized humanity that I think will continue to be the issue. So I think that's just something that I sort of continue to struggle with in the theses.
And I think that comes up more prominently in the next couple of theses here. So we'll just go on to number 6. Feuerbach resolves the essence of religion into the essence of man. But the essence of man is no abstraction inherent in each single individual. In reality, it is the ensemble of the social relations. Feuerbach, who does not enter upon a criticism of this real essence, is hence obliged, number 1, to abstract from the historical process and to define the religious sentiment regarded by itself and to presuppose an abstract, isolated human individual. And then number 2, the essence, therefore, can by him only be regarded as species, as an inner dumb generality, which unites many individuals only in a natural way.
Stirner time.
Yeah,
it is this is the critique of Feuerbach, the Stirner levels against him, because when Feuerbach is saying that we need to act humanely, we have to make humanity, the human essence, the principle of our actions. Feuerbach is potentially establishing humanization. He wants to rehumanize man, and he puts himself against. He thinks his main enemy is egoism, particularism, individuality, because he thinks that it's alienated from us, it needs to be saved. And Stirner's response to this is this dialectic of humanization has a contrary pole in dehumanization. The creation of the human creates the inhuman, because the kind of ethical mode of acting corresponding to Feuerbach is you worship the abstraction. You do things for someone else because there, as Marx says, there is this abstract essence within them. I don't treat you as a human being, as the particular flesh and blood human being that confronts me, that I have relations with. I do what I do for the fact that there is an abstraction within you, and that's the thing I respect. And that is Stirner's critique that Marx is taking up here, when Marx says that this essence is no abstraction inherent in each single individual. This is what he's taking on, and he does go further than this, because ultimately and Marx goes further in this in the sense that he doesn't stop. Will he doesn't like Stirner stops at this because he's writing a bunch of arguments against the young Hegelians. He's not trying to develop he's not putting forward a program. But Marx's twist here is to say, actually, and I think should go into the German here, actually, because the German it's not essence in German is also the word for being, particularly Wesen. So we could actually say this, that when Feuerbach resolves a religious being into the human being, but the human being is no abstraction inherent in each single individual. The being of humans is not an abstraction within them. It is the individuals as they exist in every day as human beings, as opposed to the big capital H, capital B human being. And because Feuerbach doesn't do this, he makes this religious feeling, the human essence, a principle of all humanity and all human history, which is not itself historicized. He does not historicize the human being. He just makes human beings in various stages of alienation and development from that essence. And therefore, he does it as genus, as species, as a generality which simply naturally unites individuals. Individuals who don't necessarily have to have a direct or relationship to that human being, to the big H human being that Feuerbach would like, which is where Stirner would compare him and other young Hegelians to Robespierre. For they so loved the human being that they would kill any humans who would get in the way of their sort of project of realization.
Yeah, I think, though, that again, it comes down to what is being shared for Marx. Like, if, for example, like Feuerbach wants to humanize man, what we're seeing here is Marx wants to remind Feuerbach that the human being can never be taken up in a quote, like a silent generality, which merely naturally unites the many individuals. But again, when we evade the question of activity, for Marx, it is going to be labor potency and activity that naturally unites man. And it's going to be that activity that forces an account of the social to already be enacted. So, like, I'll say polemically and perhaps like, speculatively, that maybe Feuerbach wants to humanize man, but in this desire to kind of like chide Feuerbach for his isolation, it seems like Marx wants to re-socialize man. And I think for that reason, in some ways, we stop just short of a ruthless critique of everything in existence. There is still this this unexplored avenue. It's just now the activity of the human being that is its essence. And I think that when it comes to the energetics of labor, but also when it comes to Marx's criticism of the civil society in Hegel, there are certain things that he really does want to retain from these movements that I think is sometimes underappreciated.
Here's an antagonistic question. Does the critique of human essence here really harm a concept of the individual? And this is what, I mean, maybe this, I'm thinking in terms of a basic question. Maybe somebody coming to the work of Marx for the first time, like, who are you to say that I'm, just a mere subject of this set of social relations? How does one make an account of me as an individual singularity? Thinking back to our episode on Derrida that we did about the radical singularity of death. I'm the only one who has to die my death. How does that account, something like Derrida makes, stand up to or factor into Marx's account of the individual just being, a mere node in a series of social relations?
I mean, at this point in Marx's career, it's going to be the letter Engels sends to him saying, if you read this guy, Max Stirner, this is great. We should all be communists out of egoism. And there's Marx's response to this in the German ideology is essentially a kind of a dialectical resolution of the individual consciousness into class consciousness, and therefore individual egoism into a collective egoism. And it's going to be actually very similar to the critique that thesis on Feuerbach. The next thesis actually levels against Feuerbach, because Feuerbach's thesis, he thinks that Feuerbach's philosophy is individualism. But whose individualism? The individualism as an individual, what genre of individual, what kind of historical individuality is produced by this? And I don't know, maybe, I know we won't have a comment on that, but we could elucidate this a little bit by going into the next couple of them.
Yeah, shall we move on? Yeah, we're on number 7 right now. 7. Feuerbach consequently does not see that the religious sentiment is itself a social product, and the abstract individual that he analyzes belongs in reality to a particular social form. I mean, to me, this seems just kind of true on its face. It's just, what's the note that I have? I wrote, I think this one is pretty straightforward, but the question is, what is the function of religious sentiment and how does it operate within the social field? Is this a complete takedown of religion? This was the sort of like antagonistic question that I have, because think about, for example, how many religious folks are also Marxists. How are we to navigate, Marxist sentiment about religion here with respect to people who, still maintain some sort of religious sentiment? Does the presence of any religious values or attitudes presuppose an entirely reactionary social formation? I understand that the very social specificity of this religion or that religion and the contingent factors that bring about religious social practices, are themselves imminent to the social field. But I don't know. I don't know if my question is even germane to the whole thing. It was just something that I kind of thought of in virtue of having read this. But I don't know. I think, Adam, you probably have something for that.
Let me be clear. If you like your religion, you can keep it. This is a text about method, ultimately. In terms of methodological concerns, I think you can also read this less in terms of give up your religion, you're all spooked, you're all sort of crazed, this is all social construction here. I think it's more in the sense of it can't be the solvasis. You can't make social criticism solely out of religious internal criticism, as Feuerbach and Bauer are trying to do. When we say that religious sentiment is itself a social product, I mean the idea that the social determinants of religious sentiment is completely compatible with being a believer. I see. I mean, think about analyzing the particular kind of saints people have. What gets canonized, or what becomes heretical in terms of religion. We talk about Marguerite Porete and Antiochus. There's new books coming on Thomas Müntzer. This idea of Reformation from above versus Reformation from below. The Peasants' War versus Martin Luther's cracking down on the Peasants' War. If we situate these things methodologically, we can actually find in religious struggles in ways that they are determined by material struggles. I don't think this has to be insofar as this is the text on method. I don't think necessarily this has to be completely a call to a pure atheism in terms of individual belief. Because if we did that, we'd be moving it back to self-feeling. We'd be moving it back to the sensuousness, contemplation. This is about social practice.
I'll say, I know, Will, you have something, but just very quickly on the Marguerite Porete point, we have an episode coming up on Giordano Bruno with Ted Hand, who was on to talk about tarot way back when. And I just find it interesting that one of the beliefs that Bruno maintained in the face of the dominant theology of the day was that what he believed to be a soul was part of the anima mundi, a sort of collective world soul, and how that idea was militated against by the dominant theology and producing the kind of insulated, siloed in version of a human soul and or human essence that we might be discussing here. And I don't know, once again, just another see how the very ideas that Feuerbach and Marx are critiquing are derivative from those theological struggles. But I cut you off, Will. Go for it.
No, not at all. I think it's really important to make that point. But I want to add one thing that like, obviously this thesis is just correct. It's not a remarkably complicated argument, but I feel as though you could just strike through religious and this holds, right, for what Marx is trying to achieve. That human sentiment is something that cannot be. But one of the things that I think is missing in this account of religion is that religious struggle is material. That to reduce the struggle between the Beguines or the Gnostics, or to simply be having been duped by something broader that's merely a superstructure that needs to be sort of recoded and re-examined, it, I think, misses the point. And this is an often misunderstood element of what Marx is saying here. Like, I don't think that's what Marx is doing, because I think I think any good historian is learned, as Karl Marx would recognize the material reality of the form of life of the Franciscans, right? Or the various religious wars, or Marguerite Porret's burning. These are individuals for whom salvation is put at stake, but that salvation and the struggle and the practice, the liturgy of those things, those are material relations. Those are forms of the production of truth, of the production of self. And I don't think Marx would deny that, as I think some, can we say vulgar Marxists, as some vulgar Marxists do.
Okay, this next one I have a little bit of a problem with. Anyway, number 8. All social life is essentially practical. All mysteries which lead theory to mysticism find their rational solution in human practice and in the comprehension of this practice. I'll let Adam or Will go first before I say anything.
You should go first, because I know I want to hear this problem. I know precisely where it's going to head.
Well, it's not what you think, perhaps. And it's not just because I'm a tarot aficionado that I'm going to critique Marx's critique of mysticism. Actually, it has to do with the notion of rationality and irrationality. The concern that I have is, I think, and I might be wrong here, and I'd love to be corrected on it, is because I think what Marx is demanding here is that the totality of social activity be territorialized upon rationality, of course, which entails all the risks that we find in someone like Bataille. And so I think that there's a certain component of human behavior that tends towards the irrational, that rightly takes flight from the rational, that can be theorized rationally, but cannot, in its singular irrationality, be fully circumscribed by the theory. So I think we can make a productive account, or I think we can make a rational account of that activity or of that domain of human experience. But I think there's a risk in attempting to subsume it into the positively productive, practical activity of social relations. I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, in terms of mysticism, the way I read this was to basically say that in terms of theories at the time which wage into what people at the time would call mystical, particularly the works of, at least from the standpoint of Marx, Engels, the late Schelling, who in many ways they kind of resent as being the person that takes over Hegel's position. They essentially want to take that kind of idealistic strain of activity, of development that we'd find in people like Schelling and Hegel, and rather than leaving it in the sublime experience of the subject and sort of the mysteries that subjectivity encounters in thought. And for Schelling, for example, in many of his texts, including the early ones like Bruno and Philosophy and Religion, he says that the goal of theory and philosophy is to discover the truth of the meanings of the mystery cults back in ancient Greece. And he does this for his amazing feats of logical and transcendental logic and process logic, stuff like process, dynamism, relation, and indeed the things that the kind of movements that we characterize what Marx calls praxis, or practice in English. What Marx wants to do is to take those things which were left on the side of the subject and move them back into the object. Take that Gegenstand, that confrontation hidden in experience, and move them into the objective conditions of experience as they are actually historically constituted, rather than taking them in sort of the Feuerbachian way, and indeed the Kantian way, as objecta, as processes that have to fill in the gaps between these abstracted objects and how they are for an abstract viewpoint of philosophy.
I mean, that explanation doesn't move me any closer to a sympathy with Marx. Actually, it makes me want
that
to.
positive philosophy stuff. That is, if he's going after Schelling in this, it's probably even more of a refined attack.
Yeah, I went to Gulag for thesis 8, and all I got was this lousy T-shirt. I don't know. What do you think, Will?
I mean, I obviously like have a different issue. Like I'm just gonna go back to this question of practice and activity. Like this is where the energetics is starting to bleed into the social, and it's going to become like really kind of almost inarticulable. Like the comprehension of this practice, like for me, like Marx, to me, like I have a much less intellectual interpretation of this thesis. Like it seems to me that Marx is using mystification, mystery, and practicality as merely an attempt to provide an analysis of specific power relations within the social, right? And that through an analysis of those political relations that constitute the mode of production in a given epoch, you can understand social life. I mean, I don't know. I mean, all of the criticisms you've levied are certainly ones that I can't answer. But like, I guess I just have a much thinner reading of this thesis.
I mean, maybe I'm misconstruing practical for productive. I mean, perhaps.
No, I don't think you are. I think that's the problem.
Yeah.
Like Marx remains within the realm of the human being as an operative machine that produces.
Yeah.
Like Marx needs that metaphysics. He needs a productionist metaphysics, or else he doesn't work. Like,
So does
and
Deleuze.
but I think Deleuze doesn't place that at the essence of the human being. Deleuze puts the factory at the level of, like, Deleuze's metaphysics has a different function. It has a critical function. It's a critical metaphysics. Whereas for Marx, there's a hidden metaphysics at the core of the thing. Like it's very different. Like I don't think Marx escapes a productionism or Bataille. But for Deleuze, like I guess my cop out would be like Deleuze is providing a symptomatology. Like it's impossible to read 1,000 Plateaus and not see it as a hatred of capital. To read Anti-Oedipus as a hatred of capital, as an account of the speed of capital. To say that this is an account of the human being would be, I think, a mistake. And that's why Deleuze ends up with this notion of the individual, which he believes is the at once the 0 point of processes of subjectivation, but also the perfect isolatable entity for the society of control. So Deleuze is far more critical in this metaphysics than I think Marx is. Marx stays in the realm of human operativity. And for this reason, like, I think that sometimes there are certain elements of an account of production that can sort of lead us back in. And this is like a debate that I've been having with like friends about Marx too, that can lead us back into a productionist metaphysics that I think, as someone who comes from like a totally different tradition, can be dangerous.
I mean, I agree with you. Should we move on? Number 9? Oh, go ahead, Adam.
This is foregrounding the rest of the theses, particularly the last one, which is Marx doing philosophy here, or is Marx rejecting philosophy? Because if Marx does not have a critical metaphysics, yet Marx rejects transcendental philosophy. I mean, this is what people, Alan Greenspan and the CCRU, and indeed Deleuze and Guattari try and like re-inject back into Marx, is when you moving from abstract labor to a sense kind of abstract production. The production of the conditions of possibility of experience as something itself historical. And something that Schelling does too. And in terms of Marx's I mean, I don't think he's saying human essence here. I think he's saying the being of human beings, taken away from the philosophers. The Wesen is far too ambiguous, I know, for me to say that with any sort of certainty. But if we want to say that he is critiquing philosophy as such here, because the image of thought which he has, an image of thought which Stern has as well, philosophy, is Hegelian, and then it was Feuerbachian, and that was meant to be the end of it. And then in this sort of historical progression here, he sees himself coming to the end of this. I guess that's the question that has to be laid open. I mean, this is why we want to read someone like Etienne Balabar's The Philosophy of Marx. But is Marxism at this point, at least Marxism in these theses, it's a discussion of method, yes, but it's a discussion of philosophical method, or is it discussion of a new kind of methodology to which the philosophers are no longer privy?
All right, moving right along. We have two more. We're on number 9. The highest point reached by contemplative materialism, that is, materialism which does not comprehend sensuousness as practical activity, is the contemplation of single individuals and of civil society. This is probably a Will one.
Oh yeah, like this keyword search person in philosophy of right. That's what like he's criticizing here, right? Like this is personality in philosophy of right that he's criticizing. But again, Marx doesn't want to get rid of the concept of society as it Marx is kind of, and I think this is going to change in Capital. Like Marx's problem is the isolation of the individual, the singularity of that individual. But what he's far more interested in is the interrelation between not just civil society, but like the bourgeois conditions of civil society, right? Like property right, law, etc. That make civil society possible as an utterable thing, from Hobbes all the way to Hegel, and how we understand the single human being. So what he's criticizing, I think, and maybe I'm being too generous to Marx, is the understanding of the human being as an entity that is singular, but singular insofar as they are singular in a civil society. That it is their radical singularity, their right, their ability to oppose the world with the thing, or and their rational endowments that tether them to the civil society and render it necessary, rather than accounting for the mode of production, et cetera, et cetera. So what you can do with this thesis, whether or not this is what Marx actually means, maybe is an uninteresting question. What you can do with a thesis like this is show that in Marx there is actually like a pretty deep critique of the philosophy of right. I don't mean in just the Hegelian sense, like the concept of right as it emerged in European history as a necessity against historical claimants for thrones of power. So I think that's what I would want to do with this thesis. Of course, like I'm going to retain again the problem of society here, and its defense. But that'll come up in thesis 10.
Adam?
I mean, just to take us back to a couple of points we said earlier about Feuerbach, actually, when I was saying that the standpoint of this materialism is what Marx is saying. It's a result. It's not a beginning. It's not a new beginning. It's the result of previous processes, and indeed something which is in constant, interdependent relationships with them. And so, I mean, I hate that in every translation I've seen of this, it translates the German as civil society. The German is bürgerliche Gesellschaft, bourgeois society. And so what Marx is saying here about Feuerbach and about these kind of young Hegelian materialists is that Feuerbach, his contemplation of the individual human is essentially as essentially the capital M man, the human being, as alienated from itself. And therefore humans are separated from themselves. They are also therefore separated from each other as individuals within that species, and their unity, the thing that unifies them to each other, is alien to each, and they are alien to each other too. That is the cause of all social ills for Feuerbach. And in this way, therefore, Feuerbach's materialistic method has an individualistic atomism, and in that sense, it reflects the material conditions of economic competition, which we are alienated from each other. We are free as persons in German sort of like bourgeois law to be free from each other. We are free to compete with each other. We are free to alienate each other from each other's property. We are free to be alien. This is bourgeois freedom. What Stirner points out as bourgeois freedom is what Hess points out as bourgeois freedom. It's at some point, Feuerbach probably pointed out as bourgeois freedom. But that is the point. It is bourgeois freedom, in which the truth of the individual is the person, or the Einzelne, the singular individual, in property, and their stakes in society are those are set against each other negatively, not as human beings in common, but as equally alienated from that same common humanity. That's for Feuerbach in bourgeois competition. Marx's critique here is going to be that the standpoint, and this is the same as the next thesis, the standpoint of this materialism is therefore not a result, it's not a new beginning for philosophy, it is the result of the bourgeoisification of philosophy. And maybe the bourgeoisification that could be philosophy as such, if we want to accept that Hegel is the any kind of completion of philosophy, as various Marxists do. They mean it not in the sense that we all need to go and buy Slavoj's new book. No, we mean it in the sense that philosophy purely demonstrates the dialectics of bourgeois society. It is the results of them. It is the totality presented in thought. And the principles of any philosophy of the future that want to place itself at the beginning of this in looking at the man who thinks these thoughts is thinking the bourgeois man. And therefore, this is actually a result. This is not. To think about the social totality, think about the totality of thoughts is not longer to go to a systematic absolute knowledge, or even the system of the man that thinks absolute knowledge, but the system that produces the man who produces absolute knowledge.
I think for the next one, then we'll just kind of build off of the discussion, and I'll kind of whip up a fervor here by inserting my own question. The standpoint of the old materialism is civil society. The standpoint of the new is human society or social humanity. Wait a minute. Will, there is no way in which Marx is reinserting the notion of sovereignty here, is he?
No, not at all. He's totally not just displacing the question onto an account of the human being in relation to its sociality, right? Like, one of the mistakes that I think when we criticize sovereignty is that we have this super top-down account. Adam is very upset. This is an issue. Like, Marx's humanism remains an issue. The displacement of the conditions of sovereignty to an ecological account of sociality is just the pure administration of things. Like, this is the organization upon which we understand the administration of life, of human society, of social society, which ultimately must always be defended. And at the core of that lies what? The sovereign right to life. So, like, I think that this is why Theses on Feuerbach is such a strange kind of landmine, because you get in texts like the Critique of the Gotha Program, where notions of the bourgeois subject are immediately tied to formations of centralized power. But here, Marx wants to dispel the issue of the subject of a unified rational capacity, and instead socialize it. I think that this, I just think that this defers the issue, and in fact, I would say that it is precisely this problem which we are facing in philosophical discourse today, when we talk about an invocation of the social, of society. And maybe this is just like some subterranean anarchism in me speaking, But I think
just subterranean.
Yeah, I think that this new human society rings kind of like creepy in my ears. It just, I don't like it.
Adam?
Well, to quote a brave student in Warwick in the 90s, some of us are still Marxists, you know. This is a text on method. I don't think he's saying that, because it sounds like it's not like he's bringing back the Feuerbachian humanist revolution. I mean, this isn't the Paris manuscripts here. This is written kind of after that break. This is gone. I mean, in terms of just go through the thesis again. The standpoint of the old materialism is civil society. The standpoint, literally standpunkt, of the new is human society or social humanity. This is a text on.
So you're telling me it's a question about knowledge production then, right? This new form of
Yes,
knowledge.
That's my criticism too.
Yeah, like Adam, come on.
The new form of knowledge production is looking at human beings in their social organization, which I think is a good rejoinder to Feuerbach.
Precisely the basis upon which, we can understand how things in the history of the party as a transcendental political category can produce the kinds of things that it did throughout the 19th and 20th century. I don't think this is an avoidable, it doesn't matter whether you have a Lukácsian understanding of this, a Korsian understanding of this, the interplay and codependence of the practice of the party and theory renders it necessary to state that methodological commitments are immediately political commitments.
Mm-hmm. But we're not reading Lukács.
I would say, just to add to that, is that this positing of the standpoint a priori confronts the exact problem that Feuerbach and Deleuze present to us, which is, if we are to, and this goes back to what you said about knowledge production, Will, is that if we're to confront the image of thought, we have to get under every fucking corner of it. Adam?
But I think here what we need to focus on is what Marx was reading at the time when he was writing these notes. Mm-hmm. In particular, the criticisms of the notion of society as Gesellschaft. Because Schaft is always a productive sort of affixation to any German thought. So Gesellschaft literally means, if you take the root of the German, this is a Stirnerian point. Stern's critique of society is that you take the word Gesellschaft, take it apart. It basically comes from the Saal, which in French is also hall, but in German it's an old root hall as well. And Gesellschaft is essentially the enclosure that is produced with that humans, that is basically, rather than being held in common by humans, is that which holds humans in common. And so when we say a standpoint of the new materialism, which is not a new social order, it's a new way of analyzing it, as opposed to Feuerbachian revolutionary sort of modes of thinking. It is the standpoint of the new materialism is that der Standpunkt des neuen, der menschlichen Gesellschaft, oder die gesellschaftliche, societal-like humanity. And I think in light of the critiques of society that are happening from the more basic, the things that break Marx with Feuerbach, this notion of society operative is also a notion of enclosure. So a materialism would have to understand essentially the standpoint of the enclosure of humanities, or the enclosure that is the human itself. And I think there's a reading of this which is actually more productive if we go back to less in terms of the history of party Marxism that takes this on. Because we've already seen the way in which the Soviet translations of this text, even in English, basically hide any kind of radicality to it and actually go to the raw critique of society itself. If you want society to be defended, you can go to Bauer. Feuerbach is the man who wants to defend society because he thinks that it is humanity.
But in order for the basis of society to be defended, right, it needs to become what? The object upon which we presuppose in our analysis. Marx is presupposing it. He's literally saying his account will presuppose the social instead of the essence of the human being.
Yes,
but there is a fundamental difference between relations of production and the social. This still relies on a distinction between social relations and economic relations. This still makes that distinction. And what then becomes my question is he just playing the social element of the human being against against the particular mode of production.
He's playing the sociality of human beings against the human being, I think. I mean, another thing about production, by the way, the word Herstellung is not used in this text. The only use of anything like production is Thesis 7. And he says, Feuerbach sieht daher nicht, dass der religiöse Gemüt selbst ein gesellschaftlicher Produkt ist und dass das abstrakte Individuum, das analysiert, einer bestimmten Gesellschaftsform angehört. So
that's great.
The production eventually is product, is social product.
Yeah, but that still retains the human being as that which passes from the harbinger of a potentiality to an actualized object, to a fully realized human being. I don't think Marx...
It's not a matter of realization here, because there's not a human being to be realized. He's looking at the ways in which human beings are real. That's why the presupposition of... Because for Feuerbach, human beings are something to be realized through their disalienation. Whereas Marx is saying actual human beings are enclosed within bourgeois society.
Yeah.
And it's that realization which has become the new object, insofar as it's already realized. We need to look at these things as the results, and therefore the results plus how they get there. That's the ripping out of the Hegelian dialectic and putting it into a context of actual enclosure here. I just think the society of Marx in 1845 is probably closer to the societal critiques he was reading, and as opposed to something that has to be defended. Then I think
we forget why it was really important for the anti-social anarchist movement to specifically target this text. Why Foucault, for example, in Society Must Be Defended, makes his final target Marx and Engels and the socialist movement. This idea that, in fact, no, what we need to do is deeply historicize Marx and thus wash him free is what I would call a hermeneutics of innocence, but one uniquely applied to our favorite little boy. So
historicize Marx is to read the text that he was reading at the time and associate it that way.
All right. I'm going to break this up. Because there's going to be a lot to edit. Let's move on to the final, most powerful thesis in the Theses on Feuerbach. And I'll just say, just a kind of short preamble. I initially came in to critique this just to see if I could, but actually I think I found a way to shore up Marx's argument. Like here it is. Here's what we haven't done in this discussion is this is for the workers, right? Look, philosophy isn't about navel gazing. It's about going out and kicking ass, getting rid of the ruling class. But then the problem is, what do we do once we're in power? Oh shit, now we're the ruling class. And so I think actually the changing of the world, I think this is something that needs to be investigated vis-a-vis philosophy. I'll save my comments to the end. The thesis is, philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. Either Will or Adam, you go ahead and start out. I'm just going to gather my notes here while you're...
Well, so if you go to Marx's grave in Highgate Cemetery, you pay the £4 or you just sneak in or something, you will see a slight addition to that quote, which is the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. Now, this, however, is an addition by Engels in the English. It's not in the German. This, however, is interesting for me because it says, well, the however it relates it back to philosophy. That the point of philosophy, however, is to change the world, not to interpret it. But in the absence of that, however, where's philosophy here? The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. That is you could be saying philosophers have simply interpreted the human condition. The point is to change, or the point is to change the world in which man exists and is enclosed. In that sense, maybe this text isn't for philosophers. I mean, there are some Marxist thinkers who don't call themselves philosophers on this basis. I mean, Etienne Balibar doesn't call himself a philosopher. I think I've heard of it a couple of times on the basis that it's not a Marxist position to be one. In this sense, is this meant to be the end of philosophy insofar as philosophy is completed in some sense by Hegel and Feuerbach? in the definition of philosophy as this move from dialectical activity on the part of the subject to contemplation on the part of the object. Marx swaps those positions, puts the contemplation nowhere, puts the activity at both ends, and moves them all into the objective. Is this something which is no longer about us? This is not about philosophy anymore. This is a theoretical weapon. And even saying, philosophers could be good at teaching dialectics, but if Marx is ripping us away from philosophy, philosophers no longer have a monopoly on this. And if you want to go like Laruelle, say, it's the capital form of thought, does the Marxist thing have to be, oh dear God, no, oh God, no, oh God, non-philosophy? Does it have to be non-philosophy, folks? Does it have to, do we have to all become Laruellians, or do we have to find ways of doing sociology? And there are good critiques of this, of course. I mean, not necessarily Laruelle, but the critique of sociological reason as something that also develops from neo-Kantianism. For example, Gillian Rose's book, Hegel Contra Sociology. This is the grand question. I mean, in our book, Anti-Oculus, we try to say we don't read it in the same context we're reading it now. We say, the point of philosophy is to create concepts in a manner hostile to the order of things. The conceptual engineering for that. Does Marx doesn't think conceptual engineering is the what philosophy is, because he's dealing with other philosophers. But that's kind of that's why I offered the title "The End of Philosophy," because is anything after this philosophy?
Will, what about you?
Yeah. For this reason, Sartre says no. Jean-Paul Sartre presents Marxism as the fundamental, insurmountable object that philosophy cannot get past. But it is this thesis that has caused such a strange series of reactions. So I'll just go through a few. In his essay, Resignation, Adorno writes this when criticizing what he calls actionism. One clings to action for the sake of the impossibility of action. Admittedly, already in Marx there lies concealed a wound. He may have presented the 11th thesis on Feuerbach so authoritatively because he knew he wasn't entirely sure about it. In his youth, he demanded the ruthless critique of everything in existence. Now he was mocking criticism. But his famous witticism against the young Hegelians, the phrase critical critique, was a dud, went up in smoke as nothing but a tautology. The forced primacy of praxis irrationally stopped the critique that Marx himself practiced. And then, I'm just going to paraphrase Foucault and the others. Foucault puts Marx next to Nietzsche and says that it is in moments like this that Marx actually recognizes that thought is always tied to that which frees or that which binds. And for Heidegger, in a kind of creepy interview where he lifts his arm up and pulls a Marx edition off of his shelf and opens to the 11th thesis, says that to interpret the world is to change it. So it's produced a handful of, I think, somewhat bizarre responses. But I think that what Marx is ultimately arguing, and again, I'll present this speculatively because I'm not a Marx scholar, is that the way in which philosophy has been done has been historically to allow for the recognition of an order of things, for an account of the order of things, for a representation. And for this reason, right, the owl of Minerva, can only fly at dusk. But what philosophers must do, it seems, is provide tools that necessarily force the changing of this world. That by showing the practical historical processes that constitute the power relations of post-industrial England necessarily changes the world because it forces us to, pull the wool cap off, right? That we've kept over our eyes. So I think that in a certain sense, I'm not so sure Marx is saying wither philosophy in the way that perhaps Adorno is saying wither Marxism. But I think Marx is saying that precisely the realization of philosophy is dependent upon its capacity to do this other thing. And I think that that's what we get in one of the first pieces that we ever talked about, which is intellectuals and power, right? Where Deleuze puts forward that we've never really understood the role of the philosopher, that the role of the philosopher is actually to sit in the prison, in the workshop, to lend an ear to these things. This is fundamentally why philosophy cannot be the same after Marx. Right? It will never be the same after Marx. So I guess that's what I have to say about the final pieces.
All right, to finish up, I am going to put a new figure into the discussion, and that is Antonin Artaud. And I owe a small debt to Henry Summers Hall, yet again, for his paper on Feuerbach and the image of thought, as he puts forward Artaud as a kind of figure that actualizes Marx's predicate here. I'm just going to quickly recast in different terms what Marx is saying. Philosophers have hitherto only represented the world in various ways. The point is to find lines of flight outside of thought, right? And Artaud, and I'm totally copying this from Henry's paper, it says, in Man Against Destiny, basically Artaud announces his Bergsonian commitments, but really what's important here is that Artaud is going to identify what he thinks has been a problem for thought all along, is the utter continuity of consciousness. And here's what Artaud says. You all know that one cannot grasp thought. In order to think, we have images. We have words for these images. We have representations of objects. We separate consciousness into states of consciousness. But this is merely a way of speaking. All of this has no real value except insofar as it enables us to think. In order to consider our consciousness, we are obliged to divide it. Otherwise, the rational faculty which enables us to see our thoughts could never be used. But in reality, consciousness is a whole, what the philosopher Bergson calls pure duration. There is no stopping the motion of thought. That which we place before us so that the reason of the mind can consider it is in reality already past, and that which reason holds is merely a form, more or less empty of real thought. Now, what I find interesting about this here, and Henry certainly points this out, is that the image of thought becomes a bounding off point, a kind of necessary illusion from which thinking becomes possible again, right? It's almost reactive in a way, and it kind of returns philosophy to the, a kind of reactive power, but one, as like Nietzsche and Deleuze point out, one that we can take to its utter limit and, find the outside, as it were. So philosophers have hitherto only represented the world in various ways, which is to say, approaches to philosophy were established on a transcendental illusion. Thought was confused with the presentation of itself, and has been. That's what the image of thought is. Moreover, thought was conceived of in such a way that it broke with the constitutive sensuous domain from which it itself arises. The role of philosophy is to facilitate, and to use a Deleuzian term here, is an encounter with the conditions that give rise to its own possibility, right? And so part of what's involved with thinking is being able to think the outside in a way that ultimately, as philosophers, we're going to, create concepts and systems and so forth. But when we bring it back to a kind of Marxism, we have to think that there's something about philosophy, about a text, about the words that we use, about the concepts that we create that have an asignifying quality that put in motion the creation of the new. and a movement with and transformation of those determinants which brought about the thinking itself. One other way of thinking about this is class struggle, right? And so maybe what I just said is really highfalutin way to say that, the practice of fighting against the ruling class involves one that has this reflective dimension, but it's not merely reflective in the fact that we fall back into concepts that have already been prefigured or pre-made for us. That this struggle itself must produce new concepts as the struggle unfolds. And so with that, I think there's a way in which we can think of philosophy as a struggle against the sign with a capital S, right? Insofar as it's an ossification of hermeneutics, and insofar as any hermeneutics can enclose us within the ideology or the sort of the hermetically sealed libidinal circuit of hegemony, right? So the role of philosophy then is to sunder those obstacles to the possibility of thought, which is to think in such a way that instigates an asignifying rupture of conceptual and sensuous determinations. And so that's my take on Marx. Anything else before we close things out? This is our longest episode ever.
Yeah, I think
Two-parter, come on.
Yeah.
I think that in a certain way we could say now that this is why we have to understand that the proletariat arrives on the scene to say, I come not to praise the proletariat, but to bury it. Right. And I think in that sense, this remains often lost, and perhaps it's a delicate Hegelian analysis that's needed to understand it. So I'm going to pass it to Adam, but it's precisely in this avenue between consciousness raising and predicating a politics that I think needs to be navigated, right? Like a politics predicated on the, in praise of the proletariat. That's just good supply side economics, right? But it's timely because Janet Yellen just gave that long speech at the Chicago school, right? But it's this very delicate process through which the recognition of the proletariat, through the recognition of being forced to sell labor, then necessitates its dissolution, which I think is kind of still the problem. And I think that's been the case even up to the workerist movements in Italy and Apparismo.
All right. With that said, we will close it out. So the moral of the story is engender an aesthetic attitude, create new concepts, struggle against the dominant hegemony, kick some ass, and make some cool art. And we'll see you next time.